why don't we go ahead and begin? And we're going to start tonight by reviewing, because it was requested last week that we review. So I will take us through a short review of Zechariah 12.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, okay.
Now in 12, if you read in verses 4 through 9, you see that the nations will be drawn to Jerusalem. Both God will draw them, and also Satan will draw them. Satan, of course, agenda is that he has the arrogance to believe that he can go to battle with the nations against God and win. God obviously has his own plan, outflanking Satan, as he always does, and of course knows that when this battle occurs, it will be Satan, the false prophet, and the Antichrist's defeat. And of course his plan will continue. They will then be locked away for 1,000 years before their final judgment time. Now, one of the important points here is in Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. We learn here that at the midpoint of the tribulation, of course, the Antichrist will be revealed. We find this in 2 Thessalonians 2, the verses. We're going to look tonight at some of those, actually. He's revealed, of course, the treaty that he starts that begins the tribulation period, the first 3.5 years, will be broken by him at this point. And of course, he will begin a vicious persecution of Israel. And his coalition of troops and nations, an international group, will begin to infiltrate around Israel. Now, the interesting thing we read in Revelation 11, 1 and 2, is that it says that the city of Jerusalem will be under some form of siege and threat all during the last 3.5 years. So they're poised in this last half for a series of battles, which indeed then do occur. We went over those battles a week before last. Now, the leaders of Jerusalem will see what's going on. They'll see a supernatural effect caused by God's angelic army. They will also see that God energizes the Jews. And of course it says here, I think it's verse 7 of chapter 12. The Lord also will save the tents of Judah first. And he goes on and he says, in that day, verse 8, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and one who is feeble among them in that day will be like King David, and the house of David will be like God and like the angel of the Lord before him. So they're going to be given some type of supernatural strength, so when these invading troops come in, they are able to confront those troops. Now we're going to see, actually, when we get into the last chapter of Zechariah, that the battle of Jerusalem is going to be a seesaw battle, and that at first they will not seem to prevail, and then finally they will seem to prevail. They will eventually succeed, but it's going to be it's a tough battle that occurs. The leaders see this ability of God to empower, and of course they realize and recognize that this is a supernatural effect caused by God, not able to be done by themselves, certainly. They'll be overwhelmed, certainly, in terms of troops and the individuals that will be against them. So he'll strengthen them in a way that will be unusual. Now, turn to John 19, because I think that, keep your finger here in Zechariah, but turn to John 19. And I was trying to make a point last week that maybe I didn't make so well. So let's try it again. John 19. And we will start in, where are we here? Verse 30. John 19, verse 30. So this is Christ. He's been on the cross for approximately 3 hours at this point. Okay? He then declares, or it is said, when Jesus therefore had received the sour wine, they take the sponge filled with sour wine on a pole, they put it to his lips, and then it says, he then said, it is finished. And of course he then bowed his head, and he gave up his spirit. No one took it from him. The Jews therefore, because it was the day of preparation, so that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day. In other words, it starts obviously at 6 o'clock on Friday night, so everything had to be done by that time. And it says, they asked Pilate that the legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Why, again, did they ask Pilate that they could break the legs? Soldiers could break the legs. Mm-hmm. Why?
Because Satan knew that the Bible said that no bone should be broken.
Yeah, well, exactly. He's an excellent Bible student. He just doesn't believe any of it, but he can quote it.
Makes person to die faster.
Right.
Before Passover.
Yes. And of course, you could linger on the cross for up to 2 or maybe more days. Extraordinarily gruesome, painful death. So since
you got that right, Joe.
So since it was getting very close to 6 p.m. on Friday the Sabbath, it was requested of Pilate that the soldiers would go out and break the legs. Now, it says, but one of the soldiers pierced Christ's side with a spear, and immediately there came out water. Okay? They didn't break Christ's legs. Why? Because he's dead. And it was obvious to the soldiers there at the crucifixion that he was dead. And then it says in verse 35, and he who has seen has borne witness, because John was there, and his witness is true, and knows that he is telling the truth, so that also you may believe. For these things came to pass, that the scripture might be fulfilled, quote, and of course, the quote here is from Exodus. I think it's Exodus. Where he says, not a bone of him shall be broken. So here's a prophecy that was issued in the Torah, and it, of course, plays out now, probably 1,500 years later, that the bone of Messiah would not be broken. And indeed, that was true, that it was not. So that prophecy was fulfilled. Then verse 37, we have another prophecy that's cited here. And again, another scripture says, and they shall look upon him who they pierced. Now, where do we get that verse from?
Zechariah 12:10.
That's 12:10. All right. The point I was trying to make is that scripture was not fulfilled at the time of Jesus' death, because they didn't really recognize who they had killed. They didn't see who it was. Okay? And so that was not the fulfillment. The fulfillment, of course, is the fulfillment that will come. Now go back to Zechariah 12. And again, verse 10, he says, I'll pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and the spirit of supplication, so that they will now look upon me who they have pierced. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. And they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. They will now come to a true spiritual realization. They will come to a true spiritual repentance. And they will then look back in their history at what they did and realize, look what we did. It was him the first time. It's the same person, okay? And they will repent of that. It's also interesting that in that verse is contained another interesting fact that has an interesting prophetic element to it. It says here in Zechariah writing this that he'll be pierced. What was the form of capital punishment that was enacted by Israel?
Enacted by Israel?
What was the national rule in the Torah for capital punishment?
Stoning.
Stoning. Sorry, Joe, you're not allowed to say
I
that.
didn't like my answer, but I was taking,
Stoning. Now notice what it says here. It doesn't say he was killed by stoning. It said he was killed by piercing.
which didn't happen for quite some time.
Exactly.
The Romans came up with.
Well, actually, some people think the Assyrians originally came up with the concept, but they did more of an impaling in terms of their prisoners and things.
Right.
But the Romans were the ones that came up with the actual form of the cross itself and enacted that form of capital punishment. So, even in that text, it's exact.
Question.
Yes.
The Zechariah 12:10, like you said, is the kind of moment of truth when they realize that this is Messiah.
Yes.
That was Messiah. Is that the moment when the Messianic kingdom begins?
Well, it's probably not the moment it begins exactly, but it is well, it depends what you mean by the Messianic kingdom. You're talking about the 1,000-year millennial kingdom. Now, there's apparently still a little period of time, which we're not going to go into tonight, but in Daniel says, I think it's in the 12th chapter. We can turn there. Turn to Daniel. I'll try to answer it for you. Now, I'm going to give you my best understanding of these verses.
End of 12.
I think it's 12. Let me see here. It says, it's verse 11. He says, and from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished in the temple, okay, and the abomination of desolation is set up, that's the 3.5-year period, there will be 1,290 days. In other words, the day we're looking at, okay, in Zechariah, will be the 1,290th day.
Are you talking about the difference?
Now, look what he next says, though.
The 1,335
Right.
days. Yeah.
There's 45 days more. It says in verse 12 in Daniel 12, how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335. Now, it's not absolutely certain what that means, but many people do believe that it is the time frame, that 45 days, in which Christ, as the Messiah, has now come to the earth, to the Mount of Olives, and the battle is stopped. Armageddon is concluded. These things are now done. But there's let's say, a particularly massive cleanup project that needs to occur before the millennial kingdom can be inhabited correctly. You're going to have a lot of dead bodies. Okay? Some people feel that the 45 days is the end of the 45th day. That is the 1335th day is actually the day that the millennial kingdom will start.
I think you've mentioned.
Yeah. I think that's a reasonable argument, but I wouldn't sell the farm for that one necessarily, but you can ponder it. So the fulfillment finally occurs, and it's the fulfillment, of course, that Paul so much was looking forward to. It's the fulfillment that he wrote about again, I'm going to read in Romans 11. He's talking about the wild olive tree, and that there's a grafting in of a new branch. Okay, obviously there's the old olive tree. The wild olive is Israel. The branch that's grafted in is the church. And he goes on in verse 25 of Romans 11. He says, "For I don't want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come." Now, what that means is that Israel has been ruled by the nations to the greatest extent from particularly 70 AD all the way until this time. Their future, even though they're in the land the last so many years, their future obviously is highly molded by what the nations are doing, to the point of these wars and this battle in Jerusalem. Okay, so the end of the time of the Gentiles, the fullness of the Gentiles, is when this concludes. There will be no Gentile nations from this point on that will rule. Israel will rule. Messiah will rule in Jerusalem, and all the nations must come and do homage to Messiah. Okay? They must send, we're going to see in the next chapter, even on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, they have to send representatives, all the nations, to Jerusalem. If they don't, their agricultural future isn't very good for the next year. Okay? No rain will occur on their crops. So the nations will no longer be an adversary to Messiah, to God. They will cooperate with God. Yes?
Just on a time frame, if that does occur, how are they all going to get there at that point in time?
Well, you don't know what transportation capacity there will be at that time. I mean,
I understand that. Is there anything in there nothing that speaks to that?
Now, I can't think of any verse that says how, but it is very clear from the verse in Zechariah that it will be very clear to them that they must do it. But exactly how they do it is not clear, is not stated.
Do you see anything in there that is a prophecy that says that they're going to do it in a specific manner, in a specific time frame, or in any way, shape, or form that's actually going to fundamentally occur? What is the I guess what I'm asking, what's the flash point?
You mean when it has to first start?
Trying to put the whole piece together in one vision.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I'm not certain I'm answering your question. So I'll tell you what I think your question is, and then you can correct me if it's at the point at which the millennial kingdom is set up. Okay, whenever exactly that date is in the calendar. Okay, the next somewhere end of September, early October will be the first time that they will be required to do this, because that will be the next Yom Kippur.
Required to do what?
To come on Yom Kippur. They must come to the festival, and they must participate in the festival of Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. Okay? They have to do it. So, whenever it is, they'll be clearly notified, and then the next, as the calendar progresses, whether it's 3 months later, 6 months later, 9 months later from that time, when Yom Kippur comes, they must come.
That answer is about 90%. What I was kind of drawing at is the activity right now that's going on with Trump moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Has that? I know it's discussion.
With signs? Would there be any signs that you would know?
Yeah,
because it isn't a question if it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and it's not just media out there. It literally is going to happen.
That will cause
the military is very aware it's going to occur.
It will create a huge stir. but it may be one of the events that actually brings the person, the Antichrist, on the scene. Because clearly, he's brought in and he offers this treaty. Well, why the treaty? Well, because of what we see. Because there's absolute chaos and turmoil going on between the Arabs, the Muslim nations, and Israel, and it's at the flashpoint of war on a constant basis. So this will ignite things even more.
So he's gonna bring the solution for that.
Yes, he will understand that when Antichrist shows up on the scene, okay, the Jews will embrace him. They won't see him as Antichrist.
Of course.
They'll embrace him. This is why Jesus said in Matthew 24, that famous chapter about, those events occurring just before his return. He says there'll be false prophets and false messiahs. And the Jews, because he seems to offer a solution to the impossible that no one has been able to solve in a very long period of time. The, quote, problem of Israel and Jerusalem in their own land. Because he comes up with this outstanding treaty, okay, and affects it, they will endorse him. That's why when we just went through in the 11th chapter, Zechariah, about the false shepherd, they accept him as the Messiah at that point. That's who they see as being the one coming to save them. They falsely endorse him and not the real Messiah. Okay? Then, of course, at the point that he ends temple service and worship at the abomination and desolation, then, of course, they realize he's the worst nightmare. But at first they don't see it. Okay?
Well, I'll tell you after we're done here,
Okay.
then you tell me what your opinion is.
All right. So, this is, I think you could call it, Zechariah 12:10 is probably one of the, if not, well, I would say it is the greatest day in Jewish history. I think it would be fair to say it is the great. You could think of a lot of great days. You could think of them coming out of Egypt and their slavery for 430 years certainly would be a great day. You could think of May 1948 certainly as being a great day, when after 1900 years they're back in their land. But this may be the greatest of all days, because it's the final. They've been, looking for a Messiah for, 4,000 years. Okay? They finally figure out who he is, and they receive him. And that's, of course, why we have this terrible mourning that goes on. They realize the mistakes they've made. They realize that they actually crucified him when he came the first time. They realize that they have 2,000 years of suffering and persecution because of their rejection of him. Jesus said at the end of chapter 23 of Matthew, he talks about the rejection of Israel of him as Messiah. And then what does he say right the next thing? The next couple of verses, the last couple of verses of 23 and the first couple of verses of 24. Because of this, he says, your city will be surrounded, and a prince of a different nation will come, and he will, decimate your city. That's one of the penalties. But many, many more penalties. The Jews have had all kinds of persecution for thousands of years. They'll finally realize why, what it was for, why it occurred. There'll be a genuine, heartfelt, spiritual revival in Israel. Okay? Now, not all the Jews this will occur to, though, because we're going to see as we progress in the last chapter, that a significant number of them in the Battle of Jerusalem die. So they don't all make it to the point, apparently, of receiving him. A lot of them die. We'll get into that when we get into the last chapter here. So, and of course, we talked about the type of mourning. It will be personal, family to family, individual to individual. They'll all realize this. Now, that's a summary of chapter 12. So let's start into chapter 13 in your new outline. Now, I want to make a point here that I think will help you understand the verses we're going to look at tonight. And that is that there's a change that occurs. That though Israel consistently had been disobedient, the type of their disobedience changed after the Babylonian captivity. Prior to the Babylonian captivity, their disobedience was overwhelmingly based on idolatry. They accepted every false god and false prophet and false teacher and bad king, willfully, most of the time gladly. They went to Moloch worship at one point, which was a vicious, nasty. Moloch was this big iron figure that had outstretched arms, that had an empty belly, and they would fire it up with wood inside and make it red hot. And then as part of their worship to Moloch, they would take infants and put them on the outstretched arms and burn them to death. The Jews practiced this with their own children. Okay? They had, of course, the mystery cults. They had Baal and Ashtaroth's worth of worship, which, of course, encumbered them for a long, long time. And it was a fertility cult service, ritual. Okay? So it involved a tremendous amount of sexual perversion as a part. They spent thousands of years being led by idols and accepting the idolatry of the nations around them. That was their primary disobedience that and it wasn't the only reason, obviously, we know other reasons, that sent them into exile in Babylon. Interestingly enough, where does God send them to exile them for 70 years? He sends them to the absolute worst place for idolatry you can go, Babylon. Okay. I mean, if you like idolatry, live there for 70 years. You'll get your fill of it. So he sends them to the worst of the worst for 70 years. It's kind of ironic. God often says, you want that? I'll give it to you. But I don't think you're going to like it too well when I give it to you. So they come out, as we looked at Nehemiah and Ezra in the early part of Zechariah. Finally, 42,360 of them leave. And apparently they are reasonably imprinted with the idea we really don't want to do that again. Okay? Because from the time of the end of them coming out of the Babylonian exile, you don't see the history of Israel tremendously involved in idolatry at that point. They have another sin they turn to. But it's not so much idolatry. They then turn to after the time of the diaspora, 70 AD, also, to what I think could only be called an institutionalized hypocrisy. By 300 BC, you had the development of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, and I think right around that time also the Sadducees too. Now, what was the sin of these people? It wasn't idolatry in the classic sense. What was their sin? It was what I'm calling institutionalized hypocrisy. That they would literally set up the rules of Judaism, which they made. Okay, I mean, for instance, the Pharisees developed, if I remember the number correctly, over 600 different reasons why you could divorce your wife.
Do you have that list?
I can get it for you, but I don't think you want it. Okay?
How many ways you can kill your husband?
Yeah, that's true. It's a separate list.
I don't need that one.
But think about this. When you read the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 23, it's our 24, I think 1 through 3. It tells you what the basis of it is. It's adultery. Okay, God allowed it way back in the Torah for that purpose, but that was not sufficient for the Pharisees. So they came up with all these additional codes and rules. They are not Scripture. They were made up by them as religious writings. Okay, this this is what Jesus dealt with. He didn't deal with them in idolatry in that sense. He dealt with this hypocrisy. Yes.
Were they the Pharisees and whatever? Were they able to keep those 600 and made up rules, or will they just say, well, if you're going to be a really good person, you have to do this?
Well, it's very interesting when any system of institutionalized hypocrisy occurs, and certainly that's not the only one at all. There's plenty of them, and there's plenty of them in Christian churches too.
No, we're not.
Plenty of them. Okay.
I'm just curious if, I know we've talked about this before.
What they do, Ann, is that whenever you have this system, you're constantly redefining what you do as being either exempt or not sinful. Because you have to believe that you are going to be sinless, because that's what you've set yourself up to do, and therefore you cannot look at yourself honestly or evaluate yourself honestly anymore, because you've made the a priori decision that you can function sinlessly. So what does it create? Hypocrisy. You can't see the forest for the trees. You do the very thing that you're violating somewhere God's law, but you can't accept that you did it. Okay, you explain it away.
That's like the Corbin when they
Yes.
didn't take care of father and mother.
Exactly. That is exactly what. That's why. Remember Matthew 7 about Corban. This is precisely what Jesus was dealing with. They took the temple. They then started to make oaths to the temple. There's no place in the Bible that says you can make an oath to the temple in Israel, okay? Or the gold in the temple. They make an oath to the gold in the temple, an oath. They make a vow, okay? And then they would say certain things were spiritual offerings and material offerings to the temple. So, like we said, in Corban, they would look at your parents' property and say, well, that's Corban. That is dedicated to the temple, and therefore the parents have to give it up at some point. All right? And then, of course, they'd make another rule about the process in which they could buy it back themselves as the children. So they robbed their parents. This is what Jesus just said in Matthew 7. You know, you make all these crazy rules about these things, but what are you really doing? You know, you're breaking one of the most primary ones. Honor your father and your mother. Okay? The Ten Commandments. So this is what happened to Judaism from about, we'll say, 300 BC on, is it turned into a different concept of religious teaching and religious practice. Yeah.
Plus, I remember you mentioned there was a material, financial component to it, because the more people would sing, the more sacrifices
Yeah.
were into the temple.
Yeah. They had a very interesting system going. Like, for instance, if you were giving a bird offering, a dove offering, because that was one of the offerings that you were allowed to give. You know, you'd bring. Let's say you were a pretty poor person. You scrounged up enough to buy this little dove. Okay, you bring it in a cage, and you're going to offer this dove. Well, the priest would look at this and he'd say, "Well, let me examine that." And he'd say, well, I found this flaw here. It's not an appropriate sacrifice because there's this mark there, I think, on it. So now we have these doves over there, and they are all clean and kosher doves. And you can purchase one of those and make the sacrifice for, 5 to 10 times the money of the one you bought.
Mafia.
Yeah. So it became this very ingrown, self-serving system of, like I said, what I call institutionalized hypocrisy. So, as I said also here under B, this system was the one Jesus confronted, and it was purely externalized piety. It wasn't what was going on inside you that was the issue. It's what you appeared to other people as is the issue. And this is why, of course, Jesus would criticize them that they would hire someone for musical instruments and play so that they would, as one of the great members, Pharisees, would make this profound announcement. They'd make this fanfare so that everyone on the street corner would stop and look at them. Okay, here's Rabbi so-and-so, Ben whatever. He has this great thing to say, and they all bow down. This is what this. It was absolutely self-serving what they would do.
The churches do this now.
No, it isn't. You can, for any practice you can find practically that Israel did, you can find an equivalent one, in spirit at least. Unfortunately, in the church. So, what happened is, over the last 2,000 years, Judaism has adopted what I'm calling a heritage-based agnosticism. Okay? That means that most of them are agnostic. They're not believing Jews. Okay? They're not certain if God is. They're agnostic. But they still have this concept of their heritage. They know that they're Jewish. There are certain unique things about Judaism that they follow. Even if they're complete agnostic, they'll still send their children to Hebrew school, okay, to the local synagogue, to this day, where they learn the stories of the Old Testament, and they learn certain Jewish principles and things like this. So they're aware of their heritage, but it's not believing. Okay? They don't really study the Torah. I mean, they may have it read, okay, but you can go to have a Methodist church today, United Methodist Church, and have the Bible read, but what do they truly believe about it? Okay?
I
So,
run across several people and they'll say, I am Jewish, you know, like
yes.
a tzedakah. But like you said, they won't even go to temple.
Yeah. The other thing that occurred to the Jews that I'll tell you, and I could go on about this for quite a long time, but I will not do this to you tonight for the sake of time. There's a process that occurred to Israel called Hellenization. If you read history, if you read books about Jewish history, what it means is Hellenism means the adoption of Greek culture. Okay? They started to dress like Greeks. They started to have names that were like Greeks. Okay? Greek names. Many of the Jews
did that.
Yes, they took on Greek names. They took on many of the holidays of the Greeks. They accepted a tremendous amount of Greek culture. They started to study the Greek philosophers. Okay, so they became encompassed by Greek culture, and therefore they lost a certain amount of their sense of Judaism, okay, in the process of doing this. It's very interesting to see how this occurred and to read about it. There's much literature in Jewish history about this. But that also affected them in this process. Now, with that introduction, let's go into Zechariah 13, and we'll take the first 5 verses and try to tear those down and see what they mean. Let's read them first. Again, the reiteration, the refrain, in that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and impurity. And it will come about in that day, there's again that phrase, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered. And I will also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. Notice it says the unclean spirit, not unclean spirits. It's singular. Okay? Verse 3, and it will come about that if anyone will still prophesies, that his father and his mother who gave birth to him will say to him, you shall not live, for you have spoken falsely in the name of the Lord. And his father and his mother who gave birth to him will pierce him through when he prophesies this way. And it will come about in that day that the prophets will each be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies. And they will not put on a hairy robe in order to deceive, but he will say, I'm not a prophet, I'm a tiller of the ground, for a man sold me as a slave in my youth. And then I'll read this first sentence of the next verse, verse 6. And one will say to him, what are those wounds that will be between your arms? And he will say, these those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Now, let's break this down and try to figure out what's being said here. Because Israel finally accepts the true shepherd, the Messiah, as we've said, there's a spiritual renewal. And part of the spiritual renewal is a spiritual cleansing of Israel. All the things that were not spiritually appropriate, traditions they had, patterns they had, sins that they kept doing, were being repented of. Okay? So they were physically, in a sense, and spiritually cleaning up their own, as it were, their own house. Now, let's turn to Psalm 51:2. Let's look at a couple verses here. Oops, went too far. Says, this is the appeal, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. So here's David speaking this, for himself, but also for the whole nation. Okay, he recognizes the need for them to be cleansed spiritually, to repent and to be transformed. Also, turn forward to Ezekiel 36. Past Isaiah and Jeremiah to Ezekiel, 36th chapter. And we're going to look at verses 22 through 29.
What was the book?
Ezekiel.
I got that. I'm sorry. What was the
chapter?
Chapter.
It is chapter 36. So let me read here, starting verse 22. Therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you went. And I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in their midst. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord God, when I prove myself holy among you in their sight. For I will take you from the nations and gather you from the lands and bring you into your own land. May 1948. There's another part of that prophecy. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. And I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all of your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. See, no longer dead orthodoxy, no longer a heritage-based agnosticism, but a real spiritual belief. He says, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh, a real, genuine love for God. Okay, that's what he's saying. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will be careful to observe my ordinances. In other words, this is the first time this is really going to occur. In all the history of Israel, in all of his dealings with them, in all the prophecies said, in all the things they went through, and the captivities and the freedom from those captivities, the first time that they truly become spiritual people and have a love for God is Zechariah 12:10. And they recognize him as Messiah. They've never done it before. Yes?
Same thing, trigger point. What's the trigger point in Zechariah that makes them do that?
Well,
in relationship to what Ezekiel is saying.
Yeah, the trigger point is that they now finally see him as their Messiah. That's the trigger point. And then they repent. And they're sorrowful for their past. They're sorrowful for their sins. They're sorrowful for all these things. And then there's a real change.
That hasn't happened.
That hasn't happened. No.
Well, that's when God opens their eyes.
Absolutely.
Makes them blind.
That's what Paul said. He says there's been a partial hardening of them. Okay? So, think about it. Of all the things that God has done, okay, over thousands of years, it isn't until this point in the very end of days that they finally become a spiritual nation. It hasn't happened. They've had short times of partial repentance, but they went right back. Always. Okay? They always went back to idolatry in the past.
A boomerang.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it never lasted really more than one generation. By the time the next generation came, they were right back into their own idolatry again. So, it's a remarkable day that's going to occur for them. Now, go ahead.
Following 1948, did they, in essence, believe or change their attitude when they became part of Israel? Or were they just left with the same issues that we're discussing as we say now? Nobody took any real direction?
If you go to Israel today, okay, and you speak, just randomly walk down the street, wherever you want, Tel Aviv or wherever you want to be, and ask the person, do you have a belief in God? 90% of them or more will say, I'm an agnostic.
Yes.
And you say, well, do you have any religious activity? And they'll say, well, on certain times, like on Seder, we'll have a meal. Or on certain holidays, we'll go, on Passover, we'll go to the synagogue. You know, it's the most provisional kind of activity in them. It's much like, you know, the dead orthodoxy of so many mainline Christian churches that they'll show up on Christmas Eve service, you know. They'll show up to an Easter service, but other than that, there ain't much going on in their heart any other time. So it's the same thing.
Well, the Hasidic Jews study the Scripture and believe they shouldn't work, and they're terribly ridiculed.
Yeah. And the Hasidics are a believing element. They study the Scripture, like you said, okay, but they're a very small percentage of Jews. I mean, very small percentage. You know, I don't know what percent, but I would imagine you're talking about a couple percent of them, of all the Jewish.
In your studies and time, have you ever literally met any of them that will really confess to that?
Oh, you're talking about the Hasidics, or are you talking about just
as Ann said, and you said there's 2%. Have you physically, whether you've been in Israel or otherwise, in any way?
I have had conversation with Hasidics, but interestingly enough, it was in New York City.
Okay.
There's a lot of Hasidics actually in New York City, and they have a special place in New York City. I think it's at 52nd. It's the north end of Times Square. Okay, Is it Broadway that goes right through? Yeah, Broadway goes to Times Square, and you go. It's about the 52nd Street ish. Just to the east of that intersection is the Jewish area of all kinds of gold and silver and jewelry stores.
Yes.
Tons of them.
Tons.
Okay?
Exactly.
And a lot of those people in there are Hasidics. And I've gone in there and I've talked to them before. And it's the same thing. I mean, you can talk to them about the Old Testament to an extent, okay? But what you can't, they can't connect anything. They can't connect how it was played out and how the prophecies came about into the church and to their fulfillment. Okay, it just does not connect for them. So the best they can say, normally speaking, is yes, we believe our Messiah will come, but he hasn't come. There is a Messiah. There is no Messiah yet. We're still waiting for him. This is why, and they'll tell you, this is why we have the tradition of Elijah's chair, the open chair on the Seder meal. Because we're waiting for it. Because we know Elijah comes before Messiah comes.
Given what you said and where it's at and what they deal with, why do they, other than money, participate so much in terms of from Thanksgiving until December 25th and making money, but they don't even acknowledge the purpose and why. What's the point here?
Well,
in that area,
because
diamonds, that's diamond capital of the world.
it is. You know, we remember they are more than willing to make profit of the goyim.
Yes.
Okay, we are the goyim. Well, I'm not the goyim exactly, but I'm kind of the goyim. All right, non-Jews. Okay. And certainly they've historically been very good at that, which is part of why they've been persecuted too.
Okay, thank you.
Now, what is this fountain he's talking about?
Sitting right here.
The Norman fountain. It's not Norman Cathy fountain. It's a different fountain. All right.
Better be.
So I want you to turn to Jeremiah chapter 2. And then we're going to go to Jeremiah 17 after that. Jeremiah 2. I want to show you some of the things the prophet said about this. Verse 13. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, to hew for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. What's he saying? Do you get what he's saying?
Yeah.
What's his point?
They're broke. They don't get it.
Broke how?
Understanding and mentally.
And spiritually.
And spiritually. Well, that's mentally and spiritually.
Well,
the way to go.
So what he's saying is that even though they had the living fountain before them repeatedly, okay, and I'm going to show you some of those verses, they gave up counting on the living fountain. The living fountain, you have to wait for the water to come out. What's the whole point of a human stone cistern?
Hold water.
You try to save it.
Yeah.
You're trying to conserve it. What was the point? Let me give you an analogy. When they were crying out for food, as they were walking in the wilderness for those 40 years, God gave them manna. What was the one prohibition about manna?
No, save it.
You couldn't save it on the last day.
For the
Okay.
Sabbath.
Yes. I mean, I'm sorry, you could save it. You could save it for the Sabbath, but any other day you couldn't save it. You had to use what was, however it came, it was in front of you that day. It says very clearly, God says that if you try to hold it over, it will quickly produce worms. Yeah. So, what's the point? You had to count on the provision of the manna every day. All right? Human cisterns are exactly that concept. I want to hold something and retain it rather than counting on the source of it on a daily basis. That's what he's saying they didn't get. They could never count on him daily in that way. Okay? And of course we struggle with it too. No, not just them. Now turn to Jeremiah 17, verse 13. He says, O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake thee will be put to shame. Those who turn away on earth will be written down, because they have forsaken the fountain of living water, even the Lord. They have forsaken the fountain of living water. Okay? Now, here's where it gets interesting.
It's already interesting.
All right? I want you to turn now. Well, you don't have to go here. I'm going to go back to Psalm 78 and read one more thing. Then I want to show you a couple other things in the Old Testament. In Psalm 78, verses 15 and 16, here's what's also said. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them abundant drink like the ocean depths. He brought forth streams also from the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. Now, what's he referring to?
And they split the rock in the wilderness.
Exactly. In Numbers 20. Go to Numbers 20. This is where you find that account.
He did fight.
He did.
Moses was angry second.
Yes. Numbers 20, verses 8 through 11. Of course, they're crying out. They're going to die. You brought us out in this wilderness. We're going to die. We're going to die from thirst. You've got to do something, they said to the Lord. So God says to Moses, take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink. So Moses took the rod from the Lord, just as he had commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. And he said to them, listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? In other words, seriously, based on your behavior, do you deserve this? Do you deserve God producing water in a desert like this? And then it says, and then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. And water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. There's two incidents of this occurring. But in each case, God produces water from a rock. There's a very interesting video sometime we maybe should show. It's called The Mountain of Fire. You've seen it. And it's by this couple that they worked for like Marathon Oil back in the 90s, I think it was, in Saudi Arabia. Now, where's Mount Sinai? It's in Saudi Arabia. It is not in the Sinai Peninsula. I guarantee you. Why? Because in Galatians, Paul tells us that Sinai is in Arabia. That's a real clue for you. He tells you that. Now, this couple, this family, were able to sneak, literally, into the area of Mount Sinai. It actually has fencing around it. The Saudis have fenced it off. They don't want anyone there. They took video footage, and in part of their video footage around this mount, it's called the Saudis call it Jabal, Mount Jabal. It's literally it's called Jabal Musa. Literally, it's called the Mountain of Moses. That's still the name of it they have. Okay, the top of it is black, but the bottom 3/4 of it is not black. What does it said? When God came down to meet Moses on the mountain, it said that there was fire and lightning and a cloud and smoke. All right?
The people were afraid.
And the people were terrified. They took video of this thing and pictures of it. And they show you at one point, I think it's on the western side of this area, these two rocks, big rocks. I would say they're probably, that outcropping is, I'm guessing, but 20 feet tall, 25 feet tall. And I'm telling you, it's split right down the middle. Okay? Below, in the area below it is clearly a dry lake bed. Because this area gets 1 inch of rain for every 10 years.
Sahara Desert.
No, well, it's way worse than Sahara Desert. It is a terrible desert. It's among the worst deserts on the planet. And
I have a picture here.
oh, good. Well, do you want to cook it up and show it? Here. But it's very interesting. They also found these stones all over. They took pictures of, and you look at these stones and you see that they're engraved with people's feet on them. And they're all over the place. All these stones, round stones, and feet are engraved on them. You go, well, why is this? Well, what did God say to the Jews when they started when they left Egypt? Every place that your foot touches will be your land. So they inscribed on these rocks when they're in this area. So that's.
I see the rock.
Yep. So it's this is all there. If you were allowed to, you could go to it today. It still exists the way it existed then. On all the evidence of Mount Sinai, all the things you read in the account in Exodus about how they had cattle come into a certain area that they used for sacrifice, and they built a big altar. All the stones are still there. All the pillars are still there that were set up.
It says down the middle with evidence of large amounts of water erosion.
Right. There's a lake bed beneath this side of it. So at any rate, let me now turn. You can keep that on because we'll probably look at it more, some other things. But I want to turn now, and you can turn to 1 Corinthians 10:4. And I want to show you how this fits. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. This is a chapter where Paul takes Old Testament images and shows you their fulfillment in the New Testament. And he starts out, let me read the first few verses to you. We're going to really look at verse 4, but he says, Paul says, I don't want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the same cloud. Okay? How were they during the day led? By a cloud. Okay? And they passed all through the same sea, the Red Sea, and they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food, manna, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. So He is the fountain. That's His symbol. Okay?
Should I have that tattooed
So
on?
Be a good one.
He is both rock and water.
Yes, He is. He's the rock, and Peter talks about Him being the rock. Jesus said to Peter, "You are the rock," even. Okay? And He's also the fountain, the spiritual fountain, the source of true, quote, living water. Remember what He said? Jesus said to the woman at the well? Okay? He says, if you were really smart, He said to her, instead of you getting the water out of the well for me, you would ask me for living water. And she goes, what's living water?
And never thirst again.
And never thirst again. Go ahead, Ann.
Question. Is this what we were reading earlier? When they pierced Jesus, it was water and blood and water that came up. Is this tied to this?
Some people think that that's another element, another image. That's why water came out as well as blood. There could be physiological reasons to it. Okay. Also, but from a
lot of
spiritual,
people think it's because of the flogging and
the buildup of lymph and edema. Also,
But it's made a point of saying
Yes.
both.
and then clearly there's a spiritual application to the blood and water. I agree with you. So, we now see this is what really Zechariah is talking about. And when he talks about this fountain's established. So let's go back to Zechariah. Now the sin that he's talking about, remember he says that there'll be this fountain for sin and impurity. The sin that he's talking about and impurity has two aspects. One is it's eliminating a satanic influence that they've been under. And I'm going to explain that to you in a minute. And secondly, it's doing away with misleading spiritual authorities or influences. And the next several verses deal with both of those. Okay? So let's go to verse 2. He says, and it came about in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered, and I will also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit of the dead. So, he says that they must eliminate false prophets as well as the unclean spirit. As I said to you before, Jesus warned them about false prophets in Matthew 24. He told them at the very end, before His return, there would be false prophets and false teachers that would delude them so that they couldn't even see the truth. And of course, that's exactly what happened when they accepted the idol shepherd, the false shepherd, who is Antichrist. Now, during the tribulation period,
Do you have a question?
No, my time was just talked to me.
Oh, I thought you had a question.
during the tribulation period, as I said, they initially accept Antichrist. And if you want to see, I want you to turn to Revelation 13. I want you to see something about this era, all the way back to the last book. Revelation 13. We're going to read verses 11 through 14. He says, I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. Get the point?
Satan.
It's Satan. He spoke like a lamb. False Messiah, but actually was a dragon or serpent. And verse 12, and he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence. And he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. And he performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the earth in the presence of men. Now, during this time frame, do you remember anyone else doing that?
I'm sorry, say it again.
During this time frame of earth history, the first half of the tribulation period, do you know anyone else that did that?
Ezekiel and
The two witnesses.
two witnesses.
Probably Moses and Elijah. Okay? But what did Elijah do? What's one of the things he's famous for? He had this very interesting match, okay, that he had with 450 prophets of Baal. He had a competition with them. He said, all right, we're going to see whose God is alive. So you go and you conjure up what you need to conjure about your God, all right? And then I'll ask my Lord. So they put this big pile of wood, huge pile of wood, and they said, all right, ask your God to set it on fire. So all day long, they're cutting themselves and they're chanting and they're doing every imaginable thing to try to conjure up spirits that will cause this wood to start on fire, but it doesn't happen. So he says, okay, my turn. So he prays to the Lord, but before God acts, he says, well, I want to show you, I want to make this fair. So he pours, I think 3 times, all this water all over the wood. Really soaks it down well. And then he says, Lord, it's your turn. It turns a blazing fire, okay? And that fire consumes the 450 prophets of Baal. Then they all die. Okay? The king and queen at this time in Israel, who were the 2 worst that probably ever, of all the bad ones, they were the worst of the worst. Ahab and his wonderful wife Jezebel then say, you just killed our Baal prophets, you're dead. Okay, and then they go after him. Okay. And he runs. Okay, he runs. Okay. Now, the thing I'm saying here is that there are false prophets and false teachers that go on during this time. It says, verse 14, back to Revelation 13, that he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which is given to him to perform. In other words, this false prophet has real spiritual power. He does real spiritual miracles, okay? By the power of Satan, not by the power of God. But people look at these things, and this is sometimes the danger of things that sometimes appear miraculous. You have to understand there's 2 potential sources. You have to determine which source caused it. Was this a spiritual source from the occult, from demons, from spirits, from Satanism? They can do it. Okay, they can be given that power. Or is it from the Lord? See, just the fact that something miraculous occurs doesn't mean it's of God. It may not be of God. So, and of course they are deceived this way during this time in history. So, there's a great spiritual delusion over them the first 3.5 years. And of course, it's brought about by the false prophet and the Antichrist. So
how do we determine which miracle is from which spirit?
Well, I think one of the things is you have to look at the purpose of the miracle. You have to look at what the response to the miracle is from those who saw it. Let's say if it's a healing of the person that actually was healed. What do they attribute to who? What was the source of it? I'm not doubting there are real miracles at all. Okay? I'm just saying you have to be careful about them.
I always ask my Holy Spirit in me how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes things look like those massive healings in churches. I never felt good about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know.
when people fall down.
And they fall down in a bed faint.
I never felt good about it.
No, I don't.
I didn't like that.
Have you ever imagined how you could take money and just James Baker and his wife and all of them that did those kind of things? It's all about the money.
Unfortunately, it is.
Well, I don't know. Okay, and it doesn't matter to me.
Okay.
What matters is, we have. I think because sometimes it can be so deceiving and so difficult to just, determine which one is what is right. So I always ask my heart, do I how I feel about it.
So Tim has a point.
Yeah,
Does it come from God? Can you see God's hand in it?
Mm-hmm.
Or whether this is man? Does it line up with Scripture?
Does it line up with the teaching of Scripture? Does it?
Who's taking
And I
credit?
think-
Who's taking credit for it?
Yeah, who's taking
They're-
credit
they're-
for it?
They're performing miracles, so you'll worship them, not
Right.
so you'll worship their real God.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus, if let's say they're healing people and they take money for it, but you might not know about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anyhow.
Okay. Turn to 2 Thessalonians. I want to show you more about why he says they have to get rid of the unclean spirit. It's the spirit of Antichrist he's talking about. Okay? Remember, they accepted him at first. So they are influenced by him very powerfully. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we'll start in verse 6. Paul says, you know what restrains him now. Okay? You'll see what he means. So that in his time, he may be revealed. That he's talking about Antichrist, what restrains him now. In other words, why has he not come on the scene last year or 10 years ago? Because he's being restrained. He's not being allowed yet. Okay? Verse 7. For the mystery of lawlessness, think about it, the mystery of lawlessness. When the spirit of Antichrist overcomes this earth, there will be an unbelievable spirit of lawlessness. Okay? Of hatred, of warfare, of conflict, of violence. That will be the culture that will occur.
Have you been watching the news lately?
Of course. That's my point.
This will be chicken feed.
Oh yes, this will be nothing compared to the height of it. But I think we see the beginnings of this thing. And even the crazy stuff we see now. So again, remember, for the mystery of lawlessness, he says is already at work. Only he who restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. Again, he's not allowed to do his worst felonies yet. Okay, not yet. Verse 8. And then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end the appearance of his coming. When does that occur? Revelation chapter 19, when Messiah, with a sword in his hand, quote unquote, on a white horse, that image, goes to battle, and he not only puts down the troops of this international coalition that's invaded Israel, but what else does it say he does in Revelation? It says he grabs the false prophet and the Antichrist and puts them in jail. You're done. You are no longer able to act in the way in which you act. And then
Till the white throne judgment.
Till the white throne judgment. In verse 9 says, that is the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and full wonders. Remember, as it gets closer to the time of the revealing of Antichrist, things will become more spiritual, but not in a correct way. You'll have false signs. You'll have false wonders. You'll have incorrect teachings. Okay, it won't be an a-religious time. It will be a religious time, but in a very different way. Okay, spiritism, occult practice, New Age activity, and all these things. So don't believe that all religiosity will go from the earth. It will not. It'll just be a false one that will occur. Look also, again, just trying to point out why he says that this spirit must be removed. Go to follow this up, go to 1 John, and we want to look at two verses. 1 John 2:18, way again at the back end of your Bible. Verse 18, John says, children, it is the last hour. In other words, John saying this is the last era. What I think John didn't understand is where he stood in the last era. But indeed, he indeed was in the last era. It's just that it's 2,000 years long. Okay? He says, it's the last hour. Just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have arisen. From this we know that it is the last hour. In other words, there's been a progression of individuals and movements in the earth over the history of the earth that have been Antichrist-type movements. Think of the Nazis. Think of Stalin. Think of Pol Pot in Cambodia. Think of some of the great purges that have occurred, the insane purges that have occurred, okay, over the history on this planet in the last 2,000 years. This is the spirit of Antichrist, but it's, let's call it the little a, Antichrist. But it will finally mount and evolve into the last one, the great one, when the guy himself, the Antichrist, comes and shows up on the earth. That's what John's telling us. Also in turn over chapter 4 of 1 John, verse John 4:3. Now here's a very interesting thing, and I think really, Anishka, you were talking about this in a very real way a few minutes ago. And that is, how do you discern this? Well, let's read verses 1 and 2 first of 1 John 4. He says, don't believe, beloved, every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God. Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Just because a guy holds a Bible, okay, and says spiritual type things does not mean, and professes that he knows these things, does not mean that he's necessarily of God. He may not be. Verse 2, by this you know the Spirit of God, that every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. It's one of the core beliefs of Christianity. Christ was born into the world, took on human form, and came to this earth. Then verse 3, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God, and this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that is coming, and now already is in the world. Okay? So the little spirit of Antichrist has been for a long time. But it keeps amplifying and getting worse and worse and worse until the last one comes. Yes?
Okay, based on this verses here, do we know, we do know examples when false prophets, quote, and bad guys, they were covering themselves by the name of Jesus Christ, but they were not from God.
Yes, they would claim that they were of God, but they weren't of God. And I'm going to show you some verses about that. I'm not certain I'm going to get to it this week because it's getting late now. But let me show you one last thing about the spirit of Antichrist. This spirit that kind of invades the world, and what happens when it occurs. Now, in Ezekiel, you don't have to turn it, but in Ezekiel 38. There's this battle that I mentioned a couple weeks ago, okay? And it's one of the people or peoples in it, groups, ethnicities in it, is called Magog. And the leader of this ethnicity is called Gog, right? Ezekiel 38, it's actually found in verses 2 and 3. And it says that there will be an invasion with another coalition with... Now, when you look at the area of Magog, and you go back through linguistic study, archaeological study, what you find is that the land of Magog is what would be today Ukraine and possibly part of Western Russia. That is the land of Magog. All right? Now, notice that we're saying that there is a spirit of Antichrist that causes things to happen in the world. Some of those things being extremely vicious and nasty. I want to read you an article that my wife found. She translated it.
Well, it's actually Google translated
Yeah.
it, which makes it a poor translation, but you'll get an idea. Because they just go word
Now, this
by
is
word.
current activity that's going on in Ukraine. Okay? Would it be the west central part?
West.
Yeah. Okay. Let me read this to you. Ukrainian radicals sacrificed the kidnapped residents in the area of Donbass to a pagan god. The militants built a temple near, honey, can you pronounce it for me? Avdate. Pronounce it.
Avdiivka. That's the name of the village.
Okay. The investigation of this group, they're called the DNR, became aware of a new brutal crime of these Ukrainian militants. Not far from this area, servicemen of the 57th Motorized Infantry Brigade sacrificed a man named Eugene Prohorchuk to this pagan god. The pagan god is called Perun. Perun. There was monstrous violence which occurred on the night of July 12th. On that night, supporters of this group, calling themselves the Right Sector, that's what they call themselves, this organization is now banned in Russia, they celebrated this holiday. They called it the choice of a victim to Perun. And on that eve of that execution, the man was kidnapped by unknown people. So they went out and kidnapped some of these people, okay? Brought them to this area, all right? In one of the forest zones of the village, they built a sanctuary to the pagan god Perun, and sacrificed this man who was previously missing. Edward Bazurin, a representative of the Defense Ministry of the self-proclaimed Democratic People's Republic, had told this to journalists. This is not the first time that the militants have committed sacrifices on abducted people. And it goes on and talks about a history also of this being done. This is what they're doing now. Okay? If you look at Perun, Perun is a very ancient, goes back, I think we looked up the 6th century A.D.
It's very
Yeah. Even before, the more modern era of the Ukraine. And it apparently is also similar to some of the god concepts of the Norse, Sweden and the Norsemen during that time. Very violent, very aggressive, and included human sacrifice as a regular part. But these people are taking up this tradition of Perun now. And they're performing sacrifices on kidnapped people today. So there's an ugly spirit of violence going on in that era, in that region of the world. Not only it, but I just wanted to show you through this article, this is what's occurring. We look at the violence of ISIS and we go, man, that is unbelievably brutal. But there's other areas too. There's equally violent things going on. And it's a spiritual, malignant spirit that is occurring, that's causing people to do these things.
Now, for us to hear that something like that is going on in Ukraine, and people are worshiping pagan gods and bringing human sacrifices, is like, it is unbelievable. It is hard to believe.
Well, even here in this country, we have the abortion. We have, the shooting for no apparent reason. Now, it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, there's something way worse that's going on in this country that is trying to be revealed, but it's very difficult to reveal it.
We're going to stop them?
Yes, I'm going to stop. And that is, we have a huge problem with a very vicious concept of trafficking of children now. And they are being sacrificed in cult religious practices. It's unbelievable that our culture could drop to this level, but it is. It has some elements. So, all right. We will.
All right, that's enough.
Michael, why don't you close us in prayer so we can
Keep his eyes open.
and we will pick up on verse 3, and I'll finish the chapter next week.